Hello, I'm Chris Meckley, ACI Aquaculture, based out of Florida. We have 18,500 gallons of water that we farm corals in, and we also import. So that's how we fund our aquaculture facility. We run metal halides and T5s and some LEDs. We deal with pests just like everybody else does. And I thought it was a good idea to talk about some remedies that we've come up with that probably aren't really well known in the hobby. A lot of it is very well known in the hobby. But to get started, we'll start here with the one everybody hates when it comes to Acroporas is the Acropora eating flatworm. They are probably the biggest pain in my rear end at the coral farm. I've had employees in the past. We do a lot of quarantining to go into our aquaculture farm systems. And I had some employees in the past that did not do the protocols that we do, and we ended up with them in our farms, which has been a pain in the rear end. But there's a lot of different ways you can actually eliminate them from your systems. The best way I can think of for anybody, if you are getting Acroporas, to put your Acroporas in a quarantine system, and there's nothing really you can do in the whole system except for putting peppermint shrimp. Now, you have to be very careful with peppermint shrimp because you have peppermint shrimp from the east coast of Florida, which do not do nearly as good of a job as what the peppermint shrimp from the west coast of Florida. And you don't know what you're getting because they don't really look that much different, especially if you get the ones from the Keys, then you're getting a mixture of both of them. So I recommend that if you know somebody like me that knows where to get the correct ones, to get peppermint shrimp, put them into your quarantine tank, and within a couple of days or weeks, they'll eat the eggs, they'll eat the worms, they'll basically eradicate them completely from the Acroporas, and then I would just sit and monitor them and watch them. But I'm sure everybody's seen them. You know, here's some adults that are on this Acropora here, and then we have telltale signs of having them are, well, I don't know, I have a pointer here, are the bite marks that are all over the Acroporas. And a lot of times you don't even see it if you're looking at the top down. You have to see them from the underside because they don't like light. So they usually eat the coral from the underside, and then at nighttime they go around, they start eating. After they eat through the coral underneath is when you'll start seeing notice the bite marks on the top part of the coral. And then you got an infestation pretty bad at that point. And if it's in your main display tank and the corals are encrusted on your rocks, getting them out of your main display tank is very difficult. You're gonna have to pull all the corals out. You're gonna also have to pretty much scrape all the living tissue that's on the rock off. And then you're gonna have to wait because you have about a 10-day period for the eggs to hatch. That is, the waiting period is the toughest part for me. And that's why I like to make sure that, you know, when we bring in wild corals from Bali or Australia, anywhere in Indonesia, they go into our wild coral system. And the wild coral system, we have a tank that's set up, it's 8 foot by 4 foot. It's strictly for Acroporas and Montiporas. And I keep about 250 peppermint shrimp in an 800-gallon tank. And I don't have to worry about having acro flatworms go out to my customers. We hold the corals for at least a week before we offer them up for sale. And that gives the peppermint shrimp the capability to do their job so that my customers don't necessarily get the acro flatworms, and they can feel confident buying. And it's one of the things I'm very proud of is the people that do buy acros from us, which is not very many because everybody thinks we're too expensive on them. But with all the work we put into them, you know, we lose some in the first 5 days of getting wild corals in. You know, they don't always ship that well. Acros are one of the worst shipping corals. And then if they have the flatworms on them, they just continue to stay stressed. And having the peppermint shrimp in there cleaning the corals constantly has been a huge asset to our success with keeping wild Acroporas alive. But that is, you know, and here's the eggs. If you see, you know, they're a pain in the rear end. So when you're going through the quarantine, if you're not going to use the peppermint shrimp, you have to get in there with an X-Acto knife or something else that's hard, sharp, that you can scrape the eggs off. They're so small if you're not using a microscope or a dissecting scope to look for them. If you leave one egg, you're going through the process for, you know, at least another week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, or even longer. And as there's actually more than one species of Acropora eating flatworm. There's one that comes from Australia. They tend to be a lot more aggressive to the corals, and the ones that come out of Indonesia, they're a little bit easier to get rid of, in my opinion. But bottom line, if you have the ability to have a quarantine tank, say it's a 10-gallon tank in your personal aquarium, 5-6 peppermint shrimp will completely eradicate them from your acros within a week. And then I still would hold on to them into that tank for at least another week to make sure that they aren't on there. And some people go even farther and dip their corals as well as allow the peppermint shrimp to take care of the acro-eating flatworms. That they're probably the biggest pain in my rear end. Well, one of the biggest pain in my rear ends. We'll get to the biggest pain in my rear end here coming real soon, which if anybody has any insight on how to get rid of them, please let me know. I've been trying it for 10 years. Here we go. So red bugs. Everybody knew about red bugs on Acroporas. It's a little copepod. It's very simple. They don't even bother me. We do treatments on our systems at least every 3 months. We use Interceptor, and Dustin Dorton back about 20 years ago from ORA came up with this treatment using Interceptor, the dog dewormer, and it works extremely well. It also works with killing all your copepods. It also bothers your snails, and that's something I would recommend not using in an aquarium if at all possible. So while you're in your quarantine system, the only problem with using the peppermint shrimp in the quarantine system and trying to get rid of the red bugs that could come in on your wild corals as well is the Interceptor will kill your shrimps. It'll kill a lot of your, almost all your invertebrates, like your shrimp, your copepods, crabs, snails. It doesn't always kill snails, but it can definitely slow them down, or in time, days or weeks after, they just don't ever come back properly. So we're constantly having to replace our snails, which is unfortunate, but luckily I live in Florida and there's a very good abundance of Astrea snails available for me. But red bugs aren't even really something that is a major problem in my opinion. They're very easy to eradicate from entering to your system, as well as even if they are in your system. They're probably the least of my worries when it comes down to pests and control. We also have other copepods. They do look just like this. I mean, they're hard to see. I wear contacts now, so I can't even see them. I have to have my employees inspect my corals for me, and that's probably the biggest frustration for me. As I'm getting older, my eyesight keeps going and I can't see all these pests anymore, but it's good to have young people working for you that still have their good eyesight. But what just happened? Okay, so the next one is black bugs. Okay, that was something that was probably just found maybe 10 or 15 years ago, and it's very common coming out of all the regions. These little guys are another parasitic copepod, and they bother almost every species of coral. And one of the ways that you can, I couldn't find a good slide to show, a good picture to show you guys a way to see that black bugs are in your system. But what you'll notice with black bugs is they don't get the interior of a colony of coral. Like if you have, the biggest thing that I ever noticed them on was like a Micromucil lordhowensis. Everybody knows them as Acan lordhowensis. You'll see that the edge of the growth of the coral will have starting to recede, and the rest of the coral looks nice and fluffy and happy, and then the edges are just starting to slowly recede back. And that's these little black bugs in there just eating away at the edges of the coral, and they're such a nuisance and really a pain in the rear end. These require a lot more Interceptor to eradicate. Red bugs, 1 pill per 320 gallons is enough to pretty much eradicate them from your system. These guys need 4 pills per 320 gallons. And if you go with less than that, you'll get some of them, but you won't get all of them. And what I recommend with anybody doing any Interceptor treatment for whatever they're trying to get rid of, you need to do it at least once a week for 4 straight weeks, because nobody really knows their life cycle. Nobody really knows what their eggs, what their larval stage is. There hasn't been enough studies done on that. And as a hobbyist at heart, and as having my professional business, it's quite expensive to go through all the processes to actually get your, to get that kind of data, and it's very expensive. We are kind of lucky that we have somebody like Andrew Sandler who's got endless dollars to do all these studies. He talks to me all the time about different things he comes up with, and him and I actually do work together a lot on how we can eradicate pathogens and different pests. And he's come up with some really good ideas with having a vet on staff all the time, being able to do more experimentation on this kind of stuff. He still hasn't come up with anything really on this other than 4 times interceptor dose. But it's really interesting with the black bugs because you only notice, you'll see it on, I usually see it on like micro lords first. And then I'll start noticing it on, say, Faviidae, different Favius, Favites, and then you start noticing it on other encrusters like Leptocerus and Samacoras, and it seems like they prefer the larger, fleshier corals over the, I call them MPS corals, medium polyp stony corals. I don't know why that was never put into play because they're really not SPSs, they're really not LPSs. They don't expand like a lot of the SPS and LPS do, or like a lot of the LPSs do. But we also have, when it comes to euphyllias, they're not as prone to the black bugs as the other corals that I had mentioned. But when they start getting to be a plague in your system, you'll just start noticing everything shrinking up and not being happy. And on a euphyllia, when a black bug starts eating away at the flesh band, that's what you'll notice at first. They'll just start at the flesh band, they'll just start eating all the way up until they get up very, very close to the septa in the polyp. And then once they get up close, then the polyp really starts to recede. But until then, you won't even know that they're there. And that is the bad thing about them. And if you have all these other invertebrates in your aquarium, I don't recommend you just going through and willy-nilly doing an interceptor treatment every handful of months, because you're going to spend a lot of money on replacing those inverts that you like in your system that are very beneficial for your aquarium. All your hermit crabs and your cleanup crew, that stuff it dies. The interceptor just wipes it all out, and it's always good. I recommend everybody, if you don't quarantine, you're just wasting your time, you're wasting your money, and it makes your psyche go to this is difficult. It really isn't difficult if you do the steps in the proper ways. But I also understand too that it's hard for somebody to put a quarantine tank in their home as well, because if they have a larger aquarium, you don't want this satellite tank, this tank sitting off to the side. You got a closet, put it in. I mean, there's a lot of ways you can do it. Figure it out. If you want a reef tank, you got to figure out how to quarantine everything that goes into your aquarium, because once it's there, if you didn't get it all off, you got a problem. It could be 6 months down the road before you see this problem being, arising. And then at that point, you notice it and you think, oh my gosh, I just spent all this money on this system. I thought I did the right things and I didn't. And now you've got all this money being tied up in trying to fix your problem. And that's what I'm trying to help people do today, is to eliminate those issues. Just quarantine. If you don't, you're a glutton for your own punishment, the way I look at it. And you're going to have a long battle on some of these things to eradicate them. But black bugs can really be a pain in the rear end to eradicate. Like I said, 4 times the dose, and you got to do it at least 4 weeks in a row. So with red bugs, you should do that 4 weeks in a row as well. But I also know that with having the peppermint shrimp in the system, I'm not 100% positive whether or not they actually eat the little red bugs as well, but I think they might, because I don't remember the last time I saw a red bug in my system. I see these little guys more than I see anything else. And I've got an employee that just came to me 2 weeks ago, and he's like, I think I know what's going on with this whole group of corals in this one section. And they kind of were in just one area of a 1,000-gallon system. Everything else, flipping over the tiles, you couldn't see any of these little things cruising around. But all of the tiles of the corals growing out in this one section, you flip it over and they're extremely fast. Like if you don't have good eyesight like me, you don't see them. And it took a while for my employee to actually point them out to me, for me to see the little guys. So we did a treatment, and the next day we didn't see any of them on the bottom of the tiles. But a week later, we saw them again. So another treatment went through. And with me, And when you're talking 12 or 1,000 gallon tank and you got 2 of them hooked up, plus your sump, we're looking at 2,500 gallons. That's a lot of interceptor. And luckily I have a good veterinarian that, just writes me prescriptions. And I had to actually I had a really big problem getting it from, 1-800-PET Meds is where I get it from. They were like, well, why do you need so many of this? And I'm like, talk to my vet, please. My veterinarian can explain this all to you. And any veterinarian that is in your local area, if you take and find the whole entire article that was written by Dustin Dorton back in early 2000s, and you take that article to them and they take the time to read it, I've never heard of anybody not being able to get a prescription for interceptor so that they can take care of it. Most vets are going to do that for you so that you, a lot of vets actually do really, really care about animals alone, and they don't know anything about corals, but that gives them a little insight and it makes them intrigued about it. And luckily I have a vet with the University of Florida that I just call him up and say, hey, I just ordered, $3,000 of interceptor. Can you approve it for me? And he goes through and then I get a phone call and $3,000 out the door and here we go. Yes?
Is it possible to get the active ingredient without?
I'm glad you mentioned that because Joe Waiula at the Long Island Aquarium back in, it was like 2 years ago, I was talking to him and he actually got the active ingredient. It's milbomycin oxime. And it's good to just use that because he, in his 20,000 gallon tank, literally only needs I think it was 1.3 grams, which was a 10-time dose, which we'll get into here in a second. But he puts that in and he bought an entire kilo of it.
Oh, wow.
Okay. But when you buy an entire kilo of it, when he got it, it was almost $250,000.
Whoa.
Yeah. What's that?
It's stable?
Yeah, it doesn't break down from what I've heard, but I said, okay, I can't buy that, but I could buy, 200 grams maybe, because that's, I look at what I have to spend annually on it. If I bought 200 grams of it, that would last me for 5-6 years. But now it's almost $500,000 for a half a kilo. And nobody can source it. Even Andrew Sandler said, I'm not spending that kind of money on it. It's just ridiculous how expensive milbomycin oxime is. And actually getting a hold of it, the only place we could get a hold of it was out of China. And it was so expensive that, Andrew's like, dude, I can't do it. I'm like, I can definitely not do it because, that's just an insane amount of money. And there used to be a company in Canada that would actually interact with you about it. And they completely stopped interacting with me because I was trying to just get, 20 grams of it just so I would, have a year's supply of it. And I couldn't even get them to come off of 20 grams because they're using it to make the interceptor pills. So getting to the thing I was mentioning with a 10-time dose of interceptors, the only way you can kill these little guys. Wait a minute. These little guys here are called white bugs or brown bugs, and they only come out of Australian waters. These little guys are the absolute worst of the copepod parasites. We have had so many times in interacting with these that I've just gotten to the point where we have to do a 10 times interceptor treatment every 3 months because of the Australian corals that we bring in. These things will go on euphyllias and you'll see them on the tissue itself. When the polyp is fully extended, you'll see these little white bugs over the coral, and in time, they will just make the coral recede, and not open as much. And they are really difficult to eradicate. We've done 4 times treatments and not even brought in another Australian shipment with Acroporas on for a few months, and we've still gotten them to come in on other corals coming out of Australia. So with these guys, doing a quarantine tank is the easiest way, because if you're doing a 10-gallon tank and you have a 320-gallon pill of interceptor, that's easy for you to just crush up and then weigh it out, and it'll last you a long time. But I recommend for people when they have brown bugs and white bugs to make sure they go through at least a 2-month period of treating them in a quarantine. Because if not, you're just going to continuously wipe out. Then your tank's going to get, you're not going to have any of your cleanup crew in there to take care of your algae issues and stuff. So again, it goes back to the quarantine method. You really need to quarantine everything and inspect everything. A lot of people don't see these little guys here. Or Joe Waiula at the Long Island Aquarium, he had such an infestation of them that he actually completely ripped his entire aquarium apart, the 20,000 gallon tank. Have anybody been to the Long Island Aquarium? You never been down there? You gotta go see. You've seen it, Chris, haven't you? You gotta go see it. It's a 20,000 gallon reef tank that is just chock full of massive colonies of Acroporas and Euphyllias and soft corals. He's got huge Caribbean Gorgonians. He's got Palithoas. That was the other reason why he took his tank down. He put those green button polyps, Palithoa. It's not Palithoa grandis. I can't remember which species it is, but he put them in the very beginning. And that tank was set up in 2002. And it was just 3 years ago? It was 3 years ago is when he completely ripped his aquarium apart because of the white bugs. But it gave him the opportunity to get rid of these Palithoas that have encroached on every single coral throughout every aspect of the entire aquarium. And, he couldn't even give the stuff away. It's unfortunate because, I still get that stuff on my imports and I don't even want it, but it comes in anyhow. But these white bugs even started affecting the Palithoas, which is, wasn't a problem for him, but when it was, he had Acropora colonies that were as big as these tables, that the whole underside of them was just white or slowly turning white and then just gets brown with algae. And also another place for acro flatworms, which he had a big problem with this too. And the only way on like a big tank like that to eradicate the acro flatworms was to go in there. He used to go in with a hose connected to an RO vat, and he'd go down and then spray all the corals with RO water. And all of the flow in the system would cause all the flatworms to come floating through the system, and then the fish would just have a feeding frenzy, and he would do that once a month just to keep the acro flatworms at bay. Now he's clean as a whistle because he made sure that when he put corals back in the tank, he didn't have any pests on them. But these little guys definitely are, they will take over a coral colony quite quickly, and it's always your favorite coral, trust me. It's just the rule of the industry. Your favorite coral is always the first coral to go. And with me, my favorite corals out of a coral shipment that come in are usually the ones that don't make it. It's just, I don't know, is that called Murphy or what is it? We took it from the ocean and now we're being punished for taking that beautiful coral from the ocean. But, we take the beautiful corals from the ocean, and when you think about what we take, it's like we want 10%. The majority of the corals that live in the ocean are brown and green, and that's not what we want in our aquarium. So we go looking for the most vibrantly colored stuff. So our impact on taking corals from the ocean is so minimal that when you hear somebody we shouldn't be taking them, say, well, then how are we going to have awareness of what we have in our oceans without having them in an aquarium somewhere, so that we can keep aware of everything that is possible and ways to protect our reefs? Because without awareness, they're forgotten, just like the Florida Keys. We weren't able to have any corals from the Florida Keys, and people forgot about it, and now the Keys are dead. There's not a single living pillar coral living in the Florida Reef Tract anymore because of a lot of other things, like the white band disease, which I didn't put into this because it's not something we see in the hobby. But that's a huge issue down in the Keys, and that's blamed on things that are really not the cause. It's environmental issues that happened back in the 40s and 50s when they put the bypass canals in and stopped the natural flow of the Everglades. And now we've got all this nutrients and stuff going out into the ocean, and waste. So it's humans, not global warming or climate change. It's more just human activity trying to think we can fix what Mother Nature has perfected over 4.5 billion years. So the next thing, everybody loves Elegance corals. It's one of my favorite corals. And I import Elegance corals because we get CITES permits for them. And it's very minimal. We get maybe 15 or 20 pieces on shipment out of 800 corals. So the impact of what we get is very minimal. And of course, there's a lot of ugly brown Elegance corals out there, and we get some of the most amazing Elegance corals. And this was one of the better pictures that I could find that was basically describing what happens when Elegance coral syndrome comes out. People will call it Elegance coral disease. It's not a disease. It's a bacterial infection. It's a syndrome. It is something that can be eradicated. But once it's in your aquarium, it's in your aquarium for we don't know how long. And if you get an Elegance coral and it has the syndrome, I would never put another Elegance coral in there we figured it's about a year and a half. It could be a lot longer than that, but we're just anecdotally saying what we've known and what we've come up with the resources that we have available to us. So an Elegance coral should look just like this right here. I mean, the polyp should be extended. You should be able to see the oral disc fully. And when you start seeing this, I always call it fat tentacle syndrome because, the coral will continue to inflate, but the tentacles will never extend. And when this happens, at this point in the syndrome's existence inside the coral, it is savable. We worked with Frost Science Museum. Julian Sprung is a huge Elegance coral nut. He loves Elegance corals, and he tasked Zach Ransom, who was the curator at the Frost Science Museum, to fix the Elegance coral syndrome. And I sent Julian an Elegance coral that had bright orange tips and it had a really beautiful pattern in its body. And Julian's like, "Why did you send this to me?" And I'm like, "Because you love Elegance corals and it was unique." He's like, "I sent it straight to Zach at the Frost Science, and he set up a small system for it. And him and his veterinarian worked on this coral for about a month, and it was doing amazing. And then it started getting the syndrome, and then they started playing around with a bunch of different antibiotics because they were doing tissue samples, and they realized that there was some pathogenic bacteria inside the tissue of the coral. And they came up with, they used Cipro, they used erythromycin, they used tetracycline. I mean, they used every antibiotic that was known to treat diseases or bacterial infections, and even went as far as using some of the bacteria or antibiotics that they are able to use, which was used on the white band disease, on the Dendrogyres, which is the pillar coral that they got permitted from the government to go harvest the last 50 colonies that were in the wild and bring them into their facility to try to save the species, per se. And they found that the only thing that worked on it was an antibiotic that literally you need a hazmat suit to use it, to handle it. You have to wear full, gear because you can't breathe it in. It's really, really, really harsh. It kills every type of bacteria that is known. And that worked on fixing the Dendrogyres. It did not work on fixing Elegance coral syndrome. And he was blown away. They then went to old school methods of antibiotics, and they used oxalic acid, which has been around since the 70s. And it's a very common antibiotic to be used on koi, for like koi ponds. And they did a treatment on these corals. As a matter of fact, if you want to read the entire article, there's an article in Coral Magazine that my wife wrote, because we got the remedy from Julian Sprung and Zach. And then for our application, it was a little bit more difficult for us to do it exactly the way they did it, which was a treatment 10 days in a row. And it was 1.7 parts per million. How they came up with that, he didn't go into details, but it was 1.7 parts per million of oxalic acid in the system that they were doing. And they did that 10 days in a row, but they didn't do a water change in between. So they continued to add the 1.7 parts per million every day for those 10 days. This Elegance coral that I sent to Julian that went there for the experiment now resides in the Frost Science Museum's 10,000-gallon Atlantic Pacific coral exhibit, and it's been there now for 6 years. When we got the remedy from them, we started doing our own experimentation, because when we bring in wild Elegance corals, they're almost doomed. So we started putting the Elegance corals into an oxalic acid bath. That was at the 1.7 parts per million, but we couldn't do it for the full 10 days. because of how many we would bring in. So we tweaked that and did some experimentation with it, and it seemed to have worked extremely well. And then we decided, because we had so many wild elegance corals in our wild systems for all these years, that we were going to do a treatment on the entire system. That scared me to death because I don't like antibiotics. I don't take them myself if I don't have to. And I didn't want to know what was going to happen to our systems. This was 5 years ago that we did our first treatment on the system. And then after we put the corals that come in from the wild through the quarantine, the system we knew was clean. We haven't had major issues until about a year and a half later was when we started having the syndrome pop back up. So that's why I think it was about a year and a half of it, again, it's anecdotal, but it could have been just from a droplet of water coming in from the wild coral shipment that was, another species of coral that we had that had water from overseas that had the elegance corals in that pulled that pathogen into the body, which then reintroduced it back into our systems. So it's like an every year and a half thing we do the treatment just to be safe. And I sell elegance corals to my customers, and when I put them up on our What You See Is What You Get, we sell them as treated Indo-elegance corals. And I get questions about that all the time. What do you mean treated? And I explain the whole process and tell them, read the Coral Magazine article. It's very informative, and it goes through all the details. We actually had University of Florida, and the veterinarian that I work with had a vet tech that was very interested in corals, and he wanted to, for his undergrad, wanted to do an experiment with us. They got a grant for, it was like $7,000 to do this experiment, which funded the whole thing. And we went through a 6-week period of time after importing elegance corals that we knew were going to be, I got them from a different supplier, because after I learned all of this, I called my suppliers up and said, can you guys get oxalic acid? And they said, yeah, and they did, and they treat all of their elegance corals before I get them, but I still treat them even though I know that they've treated them, just because you just never know. Bacteria are the smallest organisms, but the most important organisms on the planet. So I recommend anybody just find that article. I wish I would have looked that up as to which one it was. It was June of last year, 2024. It was either 2023 or 2024. A Coral Magazine article, but it really goes into the details, and it shows that we did on the experiment for, once the syndrome started to happen we had a control tank and we had experiment tank. Once we started seeing it in the control and the experiment tank, we let the experiment tank go, and just to see how long it was going to take, we were taking tissue samples every day and putting them in Z-Fix to make sure that they were able to be run through testing to find out what kind of pathogens were in there. We were scraping the slime off the corals. We're taking water samples, and we sent that all off the Shed Aquarium in Chicago. We know them very well, and they actually, we paid them with the grant money to do all the experimentation to get us some data. Unfortunately, the data came back inconclusive, but there was pathogens in there that were never even known to science, and we're suspecting that was probably what was the problem, but we couldn't get any more funding to continue going on with more and more of an experiment. But at least we had a better idea, and we knew that the tank that we were doing the oxalic acid treatment on, it was not present there, but it was present in the other system. But there was also, that's the problem with pathogens. When you have one, you could have dozens, and we had so many of them. Pinpointing actually which one was the problem was, the part that we never were able to get down to. So don't be afraid of elegance corals. If you really want an elegance coral, talk to your local fish store and say, you need to buy me an elegance coral from ACI Aquaculture. And I will guarantee you that we've gone through the treatment, but I will also tell you, if you don't do the treatment yourself, you're not going to be guaranteed that it's not going to pop up in your system, because we're dealing with such a microscope, such a small organism that can be a major, major issue. So the next thing, bacterial infections, Gonioporas. Gonioporas are very, very popular in the industry right now. Gonioporas used to be what they called back in, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, they were like, don't buy Gonioporas. They're a 6-month coral. You're going to basically rent a coral, because we didn't have all of the tools available to us that we do today, but they're also, now that we are keeping them longer, because we learned that they need a lot of different minor and trace elements for the systems, that's very beneficial, which, you know, Mr. Chris Woods back there, and him and I've had the conversation many a times that since I've been doing minor and trace elements in my systems with his assistants, that my Gonioporas are so healthy and they expand so well that I actually got to the point now where I can tell when there's a low vanadium content or a low manganese. Actually, it's three majors, three minors: cobalt, manganese, and vanadium. If any of those levels are low in my system, and usually it's low because my scatterbrain didn't look and pay attention to my dosing bucket with the minor and trace elements in it. You know, within a week's time, if I don't get that refilled with minor and trace elements, the Gonioporas just don't expand as much. And the theory I have on that is that with all these other minor and trace elements that most people don't put in their system, you have a better bacterial content living in your system, which most corals, and a lot of people don't know this either, most corals, their main food source is bacteria in the water column. And Gonioporas have been proven to be huge feeders of bacteria, and bacteria is extremely important to them. And we believe that the reason why Gonioporas do much better is because the bacteria are utilizing those different minor and trace elements, and then that population and the diversity of bacteria is larger in the system, which then the Gonioporas and other corals are ingesting that, which has those elements in them, which is very beneficial, and they're one of the reasons why the corals are doing well. But my point with this and how to get rid of bacterial infections on Gonioporas, if you have a Goniopora in your system and it is looking spectacular, which we all know when a Goniopora looks spectacular, they're waving in the current. If you notice that they're only opening a little bit, and it's less and less and less, when they start to get sucked in and receded, or not receding, but just sucked into their body or into their skeleton, and they aren't opening, that's when you probably have a bacterial infection into the Goniopora. Where it came from, who knows? We tried oxalic acid, does nothing for it. We tried erythromycin, we tried a lot of the really harsh antibiotics and nitrofurazone was another one we tried, did absolutely nothing for it. And then we decided we were gonna go into using you know, something that's very common, people use it for red slime, it's ChemiClean. But we read a little article on the internet that some guy was treating acanthophilias with ChemiClean, and he was using like, I think it's 1 scoop per 10 gallons to treat for your cyanobacteria in your system. He did 2.5 scoops of the ChemiClean per liter or quart. They're very similar, and it doesn't really matter if you use a liter or a quart. But 2.5 scoops of that per liter of water, and you do that bath for 30 minutes every single day until the coral starts to open back up. And I have amazeballs Goniopora. I think probably everybody in here knows the amazeballs Goniopora if you're really into Gonioporas at all. It's probably the most spectacular specimen that's available. And it's been in the hobby for a long time, but it's one of the most finicky Gonioporas that is out there. And actually, we learned that there's chemical warfare that goes on between different species of Goniopora from different regions. And if you have an amazeball in with Indonesian Gonioporas, your amazeball is doomed. It's going to die. So if you want an amazeball, I'd recommend that's the only Goniopora you put in your aquarium, or you're probably going to waste $500 on a frag and it's going to end up dying on you. But we had 13 frags, and this is the 13th frag, and just you know, I kept it with all my other Gonioporas for years when I was trying it, and I just gave up, and then somebody donated one to me. I put it in my soft coral system, of all places to put it, and it did spectacular up until about 4 months ago, and then it started to recede and stopped opening completely. And I did the ChemiClean bath for 2 full months before it started opening again. And now it doesn't even look like the Goni that it was, because all of the color disappeared except for the gold in it. And now that it's fully opened up again, I'm just getting all those colors are coming back into it. But the ChemiClean bath is not just good for Goniopora and bacterial infections. It really does work well on Cynarinas, Blastomusas, Acanthophilias, what's the other one? Trachyphilias. Seems like all the really big fleshy corals and Gonioporas, if you have a bacterial infection where the coral isn't opening like it should, it's more than likely the bacterial infection, or it's an internal parasite, and then we could get into that too, but I didn't have enough time for my talk to get into all the things I wanted to get into, because a lot of them were just kind of niche things like acanthophilias and trachyphilias, but most of the time you can fix it with just a chemi-clean bath until the coral starts to open up again. And a lot of times you'll find with like a trachyphilia, they look amazing and they're opened and fluffed up and beautiful, but they bleach. And that is also bacterial from what we've learned. And you can fix that with the chemi-clean bath. And then I recommend getting a product called not Revive. Yeah, it is. It's called Revive. There's a company down it's local to me. It's an aquaculture facility. And she aquacultures now 7 species of different species of Zoanthid algae, and she mixes it all together. Unfortunately, she has to culture them individually in their own systems, because if not, one of them becomes dominant and takes over all of them. But when she mixes it together, you're good with having that and keeping it in the refrigerator, and you can target feed. We feed all of our corals Zoanthid brew is what she calls it, because it's Aquaholics Aquaculture. She kind of has everything labeled by brew, by like different drinks. It's kind of funny, it's kind of cool. But I recommend just going on and checking her out. She's a small little aquaculture facility. She's not big like Reed Mariculture. And I always support the little guys as much as I can. Nothing wrong with Reed Nutrition. They got great products on the market, but they don't have this. So we use the culture, and then we put our Captivate Aquaculture's Integrate Reef, Invigorate Reef, or Integrate Planktivore into that mix with a bunch of other things. I could go into my food concoction, but that's a lot to go into on top of what I'm doing here. Then we feed the corals that, and then they ingest some of the food, also ingesting the Zoanthid. And we've noticed that since we've been doing that, the bleached corals that have gone through the chemi-clean process get their colors back within 2 months, where sometimes it would take up to 6 months or longer. And that really helps a lot. So the next thing, brown jelly syndrome, okay? People on the internet will call this a disease. It's not a disease. It's a syndrome that is caused by, I'm a firm believer that it is caused by either low pH or low alkalinity. And people argue with me all the time about it. Again, my information is anecdotal, but I know what's working for us. And I know I haven't seen brown jelly syndrome in a long time, since we started messing around with pH control, and since we've kept our alkalinity at a higher level than natural seawater. We found out the problem with brown jelly probably 7 or 8 years ago, and how we could fix it at our facility. You know, we import so many corals, and a lot of the corals that we import, especially nowadays, are euphyllias. And if I see brown jelly, it's usually the next day after the import. And that is because the coral already had an imbalance going on. Even though it was put into a system that is balanced like ours, it was too late. And what it is, it's there's ciliate and there's bacteria that are symbiotic, and they're very beneficial for the coral. Every coral has ciliates and bacteria that live in harmony together on your corals. It's there. There's nothing you can do about it. Eradicating it, it will eventually come back. Ciliates are very tiny. Heck, we had ciliates growing in our saltwater vat. And I was like, where did they come from? Because it's RO water going in and then just salt, and we still had all these ciliates swimming around in there. And I learned how to fix that. I just put peroxide in every 2 or 3 weeks and put a heavy dose of peroxide in, and that eradicated the ciliates out of there. I don't recommend putting a large number of peroxide in your aquarium, but it will help. But the brown jelly is the ciliates that go on attack. So when you have an imbalance, or you have a low alkalinity and a low pH in your system, and I'm saying this because I learned this when we got an iDip, which is a photometer to test your alkalinity. You know, the hobbyist test kits that we all can, you know, when I was a hobbyist, you know, I'm like $25 for a test kit, you know, and it didn't last you for 2 or 3 months if you're an addict and you test your alkalinity on a regular basis. You know, for me, that was a decent chunk of change to be putting out for all the different tests that I was doing. The iDip is a little photometer. Yes, it's a lot more expensive initially, but you get more accuracy out of your test because it's a photometer. Titration kits like we can buy as hobbyists, they're consistently inaccurate. The key is they're consistent. And that's what is very important for hobbyists to be able to understand. But where is the inaccuracy is the problem. And if you don't know what the inaccuracy is, then you really don't know how far out of whack your systems are. So the Salifert test kit, love that test kit. Simple, it's easy to use, but it's so inaccurate that when you're thinking you have your alkalinity at, say, 8.3 to 8.6, you're more like 7.3 to 7.6. It's about it's actually about 1 point high in its reading. And I know this because we had lab testing done on our water, and when we were using the iDip, I thought the iDip was the problem. I'm like, that thing's a piece of junk. And then we had sent samples off, and multiple samples from multiple systems, and they were all reading almost exactly what the lab tests were. So I trust the iDip over trusting the titration. So I learned what the inaccuracies were. So now, if I have to make a quick test, I still use the Salifert, but I know it's reading a point high. My point being with this is if you think you have your pH, if you think you have your alkalinity at an 8.3, and it's really at 7.3, but you've never done anything to control your pH. pH and alkalinity go hand in hand. And if you aren't keeping your pH close to natural seawater parameters, you have stress factors that you can't see. And you think your corals look absolutely spectacular. But when you realize that you need to get your pH to closer to natural seawater levels, and then you observe your corals and be like, holy cow, I've never seen my corals look better, because you have your pH doesn't go below 8.2 for say. Not everybody can achieve what we achieve because we have our huge systems and we have other means to keep our pH more stabilized. And in a closed environment, during the day, your pH might not be as suppressed because nobody's home. Where during the evening hours when everybody's home, you got a lot more CO2, which suppresses your pH. So kalkwasser is one of the key things that we found with keeping our pH a lot more stabilized. And then if you have your alkalinity between 8.3 and 8.6, when your pH is like 8.2 to 8.3 at a consistent level, your alkalinity can be lower, closer to natural seawater, which makes sense to me because natural seawater is between 8.2, 8.3, depending on where you are when you're doing the testing. I've had tests done from all my suppliers around the world, and they're getting a very consistent readings night, day, doesn't matter what time of day, of an 8.2 to 8.3. Inshore, it's usually a little bit less because of runoff and depending on whether you got river running in the area or whatnot. But my point being is brown jelly syndrome can easily be resolved if you keep your parameters, especially your pH, from being suppressed from the CO2 in your home. So kalkwasser was the key for us on that. And I've taught so many people how to use kalkwasser, and it also saves you so much money because you get great alkalinity value, you get calcium value out of it as well, and then you don't have to use your two-part solutions, which they can be a money pit. If you have a SPS-dominated aquarium and it's thriving with your two-part, three-part solution, you're dumping a lot of alkalinity and a lot of calcium into that system on a daily basis. If you're using kalkwasser and a calcium reactor, we went from spending we saved around $40,000 a year on my systems by using straight kalkwasser and using calcium reactors. I've had hobbyists that have thanked me so much for teaching them how to use kalkwasser, them biting the bullet and buying the calcium reactor. And now none of these people that had the brown jelly issues with their euphyllias, they don't see it anymore. And I don't see it anymore on any of my corals that we import, which we used to see it before we started fixing the alkalinity issue. And then now that we fixed the pH issue, it's not there. But I haven't gotten into what causes it. So the imbalances in your alkalinity and your pH. So your pH during the daytime normally rises because of photosynthesis, reducing the CO2 in your system. At nighttime, it gets very suppressed. So a lot of tanks run at like 7.8. At nighttime, I've had customers that tell me they're at 7.6 at nighttime, and their peak is like 8.09 or 8.1. Well, that's pretty darn suppressed. And people say, well, 0.1 pH, that's not that much of a difference. It's massive. It's logarithmic, not like alkalinity. So you're looking at, for every 0.1, you're 10 times less hydrogen value, which is a huge difference in your system. So it'll also cause suppression of your alkalinity, which makes you have to add more alkalinity buffer to your system. So when your pH is more elevated, your alkalinity, if you're using a 2-part solution still, will not fall out of solution as quickly or be bound up and utilized as quickly because the CO2 level or carbonic acid isn't as high in your system. So what that does is it balances things. So you have the bacteria and you have the ciliate, which are the cause of the brown jelly. When you have an imbalance in the bacteria and the ciliate, that's when it's usually the bacteria that's depleted and then the ciliate goes on attack. I've watched corals experimentally go from being beautiful to literally disappear, and you have this brown jelly crap sticking all over the skeleton in 15 to 20 minutes. I mean, it really can go extremely fast. So for all this anecdotal information out there, including mine, I've got a lot of experience with it. A lot of these other anecdotal things that are out there, you got to use Cipro, you got to use the KFC method, you got to use all these antibiotics. I recommend you don't do that. I recommend you go with the basics first. If you still have problems with it, honestly, I haven't seen it, and a lot of people that I've taught this haven't seen it again. So give it a try. Fix your pH in your system. Fix your alkalinity. If you don't want to fix your pH, keep your alkalinity value in the 9s or even higher, because that'll help keep the balance correct for the bacteria and the ciliate. So it's something that is a major problem, and I think it's an easy fix because of the experience that we've had. You know, like I said, within a day or two, at the most, after an import, I might see a polyp here or a polyp there, brown jelly on my wild stuff. Where before we started fixing the alkalinity problem, we would have, I don't know, 20% of all euphyllias that came in within a week's time would brown jelly and die. And we don't ever see it that way anymore. Once they get put into our systems, because they're so balanced, the corals get happy, they get healthy, and if there is an imbalance, it gets restored quite quickly. So this is the biggest plague anybody can ever get in their aquarium. If you haven't had Montipora eating nudibranchs, you're a lucky person. Because once you get them, I don't care what anybody says. I have been trying to eradicate these little bastards for over a decade. I ended up having the same issue I had with the acro-eating flatworms. An employee didn't quarantine something like he was supposed to, and it went into the system and it had an egg, or there was eggs on it. And next thing you know, I had a 1,000-gallon system that was full of Montiporas, and now they're no longer anymore. I got to the point where I was spending so much money, and actually Mr. Chris Wood back here, he came down to my facility and formulated Anticipate, which is his form of pest control from the Captivate Aquaculture Blueprint line. And it works amazing on Monty nudies and all other pests that you have in your system. It's probably my favorite dip to use. We have to use a lot of it, and it works so well that so many people that I've been steering away from using all of the oils and the other types of chemicals, the stuff that smells like pine sol. I don't know how good that stuff is. With the way Chris formulated this, it's basically, it's not going to kill the coral unless it's left in too long, just like the other things. But I don't like the residual that might stick to the coral going back into the system is less harmful to the system, let's say. And that's one of the things I love about Chris. He does everything as naturally as possible with using natural ingredients and not chemicals. But if you ever get these little guys, the only thing I can tell you is just pull every Montipora out of your system. Just don't have Monties in your tank, and don't have Monties in your tank for well over a year. Because I don't know anybody that's had Montipora. I thought we eradicated them, especially after he came to my facility and we started using this stuff on a weekly basis. You know, I was so happy that we didn't see any issues with Montipora eating nudibranchs for 6 months. And then there was nothing new put in the system. I know for a fact the corals were growing extremely well. And then we started seeing all of this again. And I'm going, where the hell did they come from? I was so happy and proud that we figured out that anticipate, if you do it consistently, will eradicate these from your system. It will not. Has anybody dealt with these things that's in the audience here? Have you been able to get rid of them?
I got rid of them by getting rid of Montipora.
Exactly. You know, that's the biggest problem. In Montes, there's so many beautiful color varieties of them, and it's something that I think is, if you have SPS corals, it's something people want in their aquarium. So if you don't quarantine a Monty before it goes into your tank, you might as well not even put it in your tank, you know? I mean, because you're going to, more than likely, you're going to end up with them unless you know the source that you got it from is 100% Montipora eating nudibranch free. There's such a pain in the rear end. And then you got the little nudies, and I can't remember here if we got the eggs. No, we did not. We couldn't find good pictures of the eggs, which they're white. And we don't know what their life cycle is. I mean, obviously, it has to be more than 6 months. How long does it take for these eggs to hatch? I don't know. I've never sat them somewhere and allowed them to hatch. I guess that really wouldn't be too hard to do, but, you know, just busy all the time, and I don't have a scientist on board or somebody that can actually sit down and get that done. But even Andrew Sandler, he's like, I hate those things. You know, I can't get rid of them. And the thing that works is the Andrew Sandler now in his big tank, ever since he was talking to me about the acro-eating flatworms, I said, call Joe Agula and ask him what he does. And now Andrew has somebody go in his tank on the weekly dive, and they weekly go in and they spray the corals with RO water. And the RO water gets these guys to pop off too, so it keeps them at bay, but doesn't kill the eggs. And he's even tried getting some crazy expensive Australian peppermint shrimp and throw them into his aquarium. I think you said they were $10 a pop, and he was buying them by the hundreds or the thousands. And I was like, good God, you know, why don't you get some peps from me? They're $1.50, you know, they'll work. But he's got so many fish in his big 20 or 17,000 gallon tank that he has to introduce them at night, and then he just has to continue introducing them because all these big fish in there, they just wipe them out, and he never gets the Monty nudies under control. Which, God, I wish somebody could figure out a full tank treatment, but I don't think it's going to happen because they're all, you know, corals are inverts, and all these things are just very sensitive to the different regimens that have come up for dips and whatnot. So, yeah, good luck with these if you ever get them. Just like I said, and like Ben said back there, just get rid of Montes and, you know, give them a try again in a year if you really want them in your system. Yeah, they're just, it's not something I would wish upon anybody. You know, I rely on Montes. They were one of my staple corals on our coral farm because they grew extremely fast. Unfortunately, now everybody's got everything and they grow fast enough. Nobody wants to buy them anymore. So we have a very minimal amount of just high-end, beautiful colored Montes on the farm now. So these guys right here, pain in the rear end, Zoanthid spiders, anticipate knocks them out. It really works well, but again, it doesn't get rid of the eggs. And I'm not even really 100% sure on these guys and how their egg bundles are. I mean, I think my one employee was telling me he saw these little, like we have brown widow spiders around the farm, and they have these little, looks like little cotton balls all over the place. And he found on the inside of, in between some zoanthid polyps, these really tiny looking, almost looked like little cotton. I'm like, that could have been the eggs. So he's in there with the tweezers and a microscope. You know, I don't want to have to deal with that. You know, we bring in wild corals. We know we're going to have pests on them. We dip them as we see necessary, but eradicating these guys isn't very difficult. It's kind of like what you want to do when you have like an acro-eating flatworm. Just quarantine your zoanthids for, you know, a good month, and take them out and dip them regularly, and make sure that they don't have them on. Because they will decimate zoanthid colonies, and they can become a real plague. You can use 6-line wrasses. Absolutely love the little guys. Melanoris wrasses are very good to put in your systems to get rid of them. Actually, a lot of the smaller predatory wrasses. I love wet morella wrasses. It's one of my favorites. I know they go after them. Little yellow chorus wrasses do an extremely good job at taking care of them. But it's, you know, there's a lot of ways you can keep these guys under control if they're like, you know, a lot of people are like, well, I have a huge rockscape and I can't take it out because it's on the bottom rock. I'd have to take my whole rockscape apart. Well, that's because you didn't quarantine and you don't have all the right, natural predators to take care of them. The other thing that really takes care of these guys is peppermint shrimp. The problem with putting peppermint shrimp in your main aquarium is when all of the pests that you want eradicated, aptasias, or the pests that are on your corals are eradicated, you still have peppermint shrimp to feed. Well, peppermint shrimp are voracious little bastards, and they will start eating your lords, they'll start eating your acanthos, they'll start eating your euphyllias, they'll just start eating all of your corals. Even the ones that I get from the west coast of Florida, which have a better track record from eating, they don't eat corals nearly as bad as some of the other species of peppermint shrimp that are out there. But they're going to go, once they eradicate their normal, the basic food sources that they would have, they will start going after your corals. And at that point, it's, okay, do I put a big fish in here to eat them, or do I put traps in? And then if you don't get them all out, you still end up losing some of your prized pieces, and you paid $6 for a peppermint shrimp, retail, and now you've got a $70, $80, $100, $200 coral that's being decimated by a peppermint shrimp. So I don't recommend putting them in your tank, and maybe one or two, but it's still a risk. Then you got these little guys, which they're not so bad. I mean, they're not nearly like the Montipora eating nudibranchs, but you basically have the same remedies to get rid of these guys as you would with a lot of the other pests that, other than the copepods like we were talking about, just your anticipate dip works, or your favorite coral dip will take care of them. I've used multiple types of dips on these. I've even used, my favorite dip of, when we're doing something, a small batch, is just to use pure Lugol solution, because Lugols will actually, stun, and if they're in it long enough, will kill. But Lugols will pretty much stun any of the pests that you can get and also at the same time where they bit the coral, you're sterilizing the coral. So it's not like you're using some other chemical that's not actually benefiting the coral itself, other than eradicating the pest that you're looking for. Iodine's a good all-around dip because it does eradicate the pest, and it also sterilizes any cuts and bites and stuff like that that the coral can have. But the
pure, you don't dilute it?
Lugols?
Yeah.
Not in the dip. I make my dips look like, I tell everybody, my regimen is, and I do this very conservatively, because you can overdose with a dip, and especially if you're like me and you're doing a million things at once, and you forget the corals in that dip. If you do a darker than everybody knows what Arizona green tea is. I use a white bucket, a white container, and I put enough Lugols in to make it look like Arizona green tea. That gives you a little bit of a buffer. In 15 minutes time, if you're using a turkey baster or a pipetter to any of the stunned parasites to get them off of your coral, you're okay. 15 minutes is what I recommend anybody with that particular type, when they use the dip that way. But if you forget about the coral, like I've done dozens of times with the dip in that strength, an hour later, 2 hours later, the coral doesn't die. But if you have a really strong iodine dip, you can do permanent damage to the coral where it won't come back from that. So that is why I always say use straight Lugol solution to do a dip to get rid of a lot of the different parasites. If you just have a small batch you want to do, it works extremely well. I mean, you can use a small little container like this big, and you only need to add 3 or 4, 5, 6 drops of pure Lugols. As pure as we're allowed to purchase it nowadays. It's gotten much weaker over the years because of regulations on that product. Straight Lugols is always my go-to dip. I mean, I always keep it on hand because it's easier to just take a dropper and visually look at it than using something that's clear and having to measure and I put too much in, I got to go back and. Those dips scare me with the chemicals that are in them because I don't like using too much, and using too little doesn't always work. So that's why, the Lugols and the Anticipate, I think Chris has a 16 ounce dip, a gallon dip, and then you make me 7-gallon dips. So, I mean, that's what I have to use when we're dipping, is like a 7-gallon dip. This is something that also I had to touch on. I learned something just recently. I'm going over my time, but if everybody's cool with it, I'm just going to go over this. I think this is my last one here. Recordia yumas, they're absolutely stunning. How many people in here have tried a Recordia yuma in their aquarium and had bad luck? It bleached and died. okay? Well, have you ever had a Florida Recordia in that aquarium? Nope. We learned that because as a wholesaler, we have a hard time being able to have like a region-specific system. You know, we have so much water volume and we have such large systems that some of the regions that we get corals from, we get small batches. Like when I would get anything from the Caribbean, I would get a small batch. I say small batch, but you're talking 300 to 500 Recordia polyps at one time. And when we get Yumas from Indonesia or from Australia, which we don't buy because they get crazy money for them domestically, and that's what they want to charge me for them, and no American's going to spend 550 or 600 bucks on a big Recordia Yuma. So what I'm getting at here is when we mix all these different regions, we're learning that there's chemical warfare that goes on as well as biological warfare that goes on. And again, we don't have the resources and the funding to be able to figure out exactly what it is, but anecdotally, we can tell you that if we have Recordia Yumas coming from overseas and we put them in a system, we couldn't figure it out for years, but I usually always keep Recordia Floridas when they're around, which they're not anymore because they bleached again a little over a year ago. They'll come back in 5 years and we'll have them again, but the Recordia Floridas that were spread throughout my import systems, we found that there's either chemical warfare or bacterial warfare that goes on. And the reason we know this is because Australia is a very strict country on whether or not you can import specific living organisms. And somebody got through the cracks 100 Florida Recordias. They smuggled them into Australia. And if you've ever seen an Australian hobbyist aquarium, I don't think I've ever seen one that didn't have a big, beautiful Recordia Yuma in it. And all these Aussies, they are proud of their Recordia Yumas. And everybody over there always wanted Florida Recordias. Well, this guy that smuggled these into the country sold them off to hobbyists. And most of these hobbyists that purchased them loved the corallomorphs. So they were buying them, putting them in with Recordia Yumas. And everything was spectacular. They're super happy. They finally got a Florida Recordia. And a couple of weeks later, they noticed that their big Yumas are bleaching. And they've had them for years. And they don't understand what happened to their Recordia Yumas. And the Florida Recordia is sitting there happy, not even skipping a beat, nothing's wrong with it. And then one by one, every single Florida Recordia Yuma in the entire tank shrivels up and dies. And the only thing left is the Florida Recordia. The only real thing you can come to think about is, okay, these things were thriving in here. I put this Recordia Florida in here. Something came in on that Florida Recordia or lived in that Florida Recordia that is now in the water column that now the Yumas have ingested and now they're dying. Is it chemical warfare? Is it biological warfare? We don't know. Hasn't been figured out yet. But if you have and you want Recordia Yumas from Indonesia or wherever, and we had the same problem at our farm, where why were all of the Yumas coming in? They look spectacular. If we didn't sell them in a week, they were dead. And then when we did sell them, people would be like, they're bleached. Like a week later, they're dying. So now that we haven't had Recordia Floridas for a little over a year, we have much better success. It's not perfect. They're still losing the Recordia Yumas here and there, but it doesn't happen quickly anymore. It happens slowly. So my theory is you cannot keep Recordia Floridas with Recordia Yumas or you're going to lose your Yumas. And Yumas are a lot more expensive than a Florida Recordia is. So just a little bit of information for people to keep in mind when they're wanting a Recordia Yuma. If you have Florida Recordias, don't do it. Don't save your money because you're looking at probably 150 to 200 bucks in most cases for a really big Recordia Yuma from Indonesia. And your Florida Recordia that costs you 25 bucks is going to probably be the demise of that coral. So save your money. Well, that's it. That's what I had to talk about today. Does anybody have any questions